Good afternoon. I'm Nam Younwoo from KIMSA. As the chair said, in this session we are going to talk about marine fuels, and we are going to talk about how new marine fuels will be introduced. So that's the topic of my presentation. As you can see on the slide, the title of my presentation is Greenhouse Gas Emissions from Vessels, and what vessels will need to do to reduce greenhouse gas emission. This is the content of my presentation. I will talk about greenhouse gas emission from vessels, and then I will talk about South Korea's direction to achieve carbon neutrality, and then I will touch upon transportation in the maritime sector. For now, we are discussing some issues regarding maritime transportation. Then I will give you a summary at the end. First, let's talk about greenhouse gas emission from vessels. Let's take a look at the picture on the slide. This was taken in Arctic area, North Pole. The ice sheets are melting more than before. This is happening because of greenhouse gas emission. Greenhouse gas emissions are not just from vessels, but still, the shipping industry accounts for 2 to 3% of the total GHG emission in the world. IMO recognized the share, but the international shipping is playing a very important role at the global community. That is why there have been regulations on GHG emissions from vessels. Before we talk about GHG, we should talk about where we started talking about greenhouse gas emissions. You must be familiar with the Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement. Regulations on GHG emissions from vessels, they were not introduced out of nowhere. When Kyoto Protocol was first introduced, not all countries ratified the protocol. Only some developed countries signed the Kyoto Protocol. They had a common goal of reducing greenhouse gas emission, but their goals have not been met. So in 2015, countries got together to sign Paris Agreement. Under the Paris Agreement, countries signed the agreement were recognized as parties of the agreement. So with Paris Agreement in place, countries agree to do their best to limit the global temperature by 2 degrees compared to the pre-industrial level by 2050. So depending on NDCs, each country was required to submit their target. Different countries have different target dates, but most of the countries target 2025 or 2030. In Korea is no exception. Korea submitted an adjusted target. So each country has a target of greenhouse gas emission. And this is the share of GHG emissions from coastal vessels, and IMO also set its goals for greenhouse gas emission reduction. I will talk about it more on the later slides. Yes, we had Kyoto Protocol, and IMO recognized the seriousness of greenhouse gas emissions from vessels, and since then there have been ongoing discussions. And you must be familiar with EEDI. It was agreed in 2010, and it took effect in 2013. And in 2014, a stronger or more stringent regulations took effect. And even now, We have more stringent regulations regarding greenhouse gas emissions from vessels. EEDI covers hull formation and propellers, but it doesn't cover emissions. And this is when the DCS was introduced, and it became effective in 2018. As of 2020, there are 27,000 vessels that are covered by these greenhouse gas emission regulations, and they belong to 111 organizations. And IMO does comprehensive and full analysis on the emission. Why is it doing it? Because IMO recognized the importance of scientific data. So when you talk about GHG emission reduction, we have to mention alternative fuels, and GHG regulations will always relate to alternative fuels. In 2018, IMO adopted a new greenhouse gas emission reduction policy, and at MEPC 72, new regulation was adopted. So by 2050, emissions from international shipping should be reduced by 50%. This is a very ambitious goal. So let's take a look at the initial IMO GHG strategy. Since the adoption every 5 years, the strategy should be reviewed to see whether the strategy is effective or not. And if it turns out it's not effective, revisions will be adopted. Developed and developing countries all have to meet the requirements, and this strategy and regulations are required to be applied and complied in all countries. So as early as possible, by the end of this century, IMO is trying to introduce GHG, zero emissions, from this sector. So we have to develop new technologies, and by 2050, we have to develop technologies to reduce CO2 emissions by 70%. Once again, this is a very ambitious goal. And let's talk about greenhouse gas emissions. Compared to 2008, by 2050, greenhouse gas emission should be reduced by 50% according to the IMO strategy. To achieve the goals, IMO has introduced new strategies and regulations and guidelines, and they will continue to introduce new strategies. And IMO is trying to set more aggressive targets. And IMO has three strategies: short-term, mid-term, and long-term strategies. Each strategy has sub-plans or action plans. Okay, let's take a look at the initial strategy. EEDI should be improved, and it will be more strongly executed. And regarding GHG reduction, we have to come up with a solution to reduce carbon intensity. And there are action plans under the short-term strategy. EEXI and CII are those action plans regarded as short-term measures. And IMO is not giving this burden only to shipping companies and governments. That's why IMO is trying to build a research center called IMRB, and this is part of IMO's midterm strategy. So overall, this table shows IMO's strategies. There are three groups: Group A, Group B, and Group C under the initial strategy. And some part of the strategies are already in effect. And Group A is regarded with EDI and CII to review whether the strategy is effective. DCS will be refined further. And this is part of strategy B. And nature strategy C means what action plans are required at the national level, and everything else will be defined by the IMO. GHG study was completed in 2020, and the report was published in the following year. And since then, IMO has developed policies to reduce greenhouse gas. It's not technically it's not policy, it's a regulation. So EDI, EXI, and CII are all part of IMO's regulations. And if I can add one more thing is life cycle assessment. And IMO is developing a guideline on LCA. It will be completed sooner rather than later. And under the midterm strategy, there will be carbon pricing and fuel pricing and market-based measures. And MEPC is actively discussing these midterm measures. Overall, at MEPC 79, scheduled for this December, we will have a clearer picture. In the longer term, we will discuss carbon zero fuel or fossil-free fuel. There is an ongoing technical assessment on those fuels. For the past 2 weeks, CCC was discussed, and ammonia-fueled vessels and hydrogen-fueled vessels were actively discussed as well. Now let's take a look at the picture at the bottom. The picture shows DNV's data. This shows where we are heading. As you can see, we used to depend on fossil fuels, but we are shifting to LNG. But to meet GHG regulations, we are introducing ammonia and other alternative fuels. And hydrogen is taking a very small share here. Regarding GHG in international shipping, IMO publishes a report every 10 years, and IMO recently published a report for 2025. Currently, international shipping is accounting for about 2.89% of the total greenhouse emission in the world, and international shipping has been more active. In 2018, international shipping made up 2.76% of the total GHG emissions, but as the global trade increases, its share increases as well. That is why IMO is trying to introduce more stringent regulations on GHG emissions from vessels. Then, what is going to be discussed at the IMO to reduce GHG? One of the things I should mention is life cycle assessment. Another thing is new alternative fuels, and that requires a discussion of new safety measures. And then I should mention DCS. DCS is needed because we want to have more effective data. Then IMO will develop new strategies based on their assessments, and especially their assessments of impacts on states. Next, let's talk about Korea. Korea has introduced new policies and strategies as well to achieve carbon neutrality. Complying with regulations of the IMO and COP, Korea announced its carbon neutrality target. And this year, it enacted a new law regarding carbon neutrality. By 2030, Korea is targeting to reduce greenhouse gas emission over the 40%. It's Korea's NDC. As you can read on the slide, the goal is to reduce GHG by 40% by 2030, and it will have a vision to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. Korea also has developed a plan what it needs to do to reduce greenhouse gas emission, and it also has some rationale not to burden the public and the shipping industry. The government will have a role to play here, and financial support has been given to industries to reduce GHG emissions. And the Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries introduced a Green Shipping Act in 2020. The act stipulates support and infrastructure the government will provide for the shipping industry. So the plan of 2030 Green Ship K promotion strategy is in place. Under the strategy, by 2030, Korea has a goal of developing technologies to reduce GHG by 70%. The leading technologies that Korea is talking about here is ammonia and green hydrogen and blue hydrogen. And all of this requires new technologies. So as of now, the private sector is facing tremendous challenges. So the government will start with government vessels in its Green Ship K promotion. So all new vessels should be green ships. So by 2030, all vessels operating in Korea will be green vessels under the strategy. Let me briefly tell you about the financial support from the government. The Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries divided vessels into ocean-going vessels and vessels operating in Korea's waters. EXI and CII, their regulations are quite tough, and 5 billion won of budget has been already allocated to support the shipping industry to meet regulations of EXI and CII. And next year, the budget is expected to increase. Not only financial support, but support for R&D will be provided this year. And 250 billion won of a budget will be allocated here. And the budget will be used for technology development to reduce GHG. Starting last year, an increasing budget has been set for our efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emission. So you don't have to be intimidated by the requirement to reduce greenhouse gas emission. So let's talk about decarbonization in the shipping industries. Let me share some perspectives in Korea and in other countries. Greenhouse gas emission issues are serious issues, and there is a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emission by 50% in the international shipping by 2030. Many countries, shipping companies, and stakeholders are actively discussing how to achieve that goal. Here, the most important thing is to exactly and accurately predict what's going to happen in the market and what's going to change regarding demand in the market. And what technologies should we develop? That is the question that people ask the most. And let's assume that by 2050 we use new alternative fuels. Does it necessarily mean that we will achieve the greenhouse gas emission reduction goal? And that requires more discussions. In the short term, I cannot say for sure that we have technologies to reduce GHG emission. So we have to think about the mid-term measures. In the past, we weren't even able to predict how much it will cost to use ammonia and hydrogen as marine fuels. In International Energy Agency and other international organizations did some research. The second or the third generation of biofuel will be more effective, and they are starting to talk about e-fuel, especially ammonia. And ammonia is expected to play the biggest role as an alternative fuel, and its price and methanol will cost $40 to $50 per megawatt. This is the number you get when you convert the number into output. So please focus on the green part. So over time, by 2030 or by 2040, the price will go down significantly. The same thing can be said of ammonia. Ammonia is 3 to 4 times more expensive than existing or traditional fuels, but by 2030 or 2040, its price will go down as cheap as traditional fuels, according to some reports. So ammonia and methanol have this potential. It has greater potential now compared to 2019. As I said, there are many reports that predict LNG, biofuel, and gaseous fuel, and hydrogen, ammonia, and methanol will be used more, and all of them have their advantages and disadvantages. The traditional fuels do not contribute to reduce GHG emission. Zero carbon fuels have higher chances of reducing GHG emission, but we also have to consider whether those fuels can be used as marine fuels. If you think about hydrogen, ammonia, they have disadvantages. Red represents their challenges. But unfortunately, or coincidentally, there are predictions that we have to continue to use ICEs, as you heard in the keynote speech. Vessels will not be operated without ICEs at all, even if alternative fuels will be more available. The keynote speaker focused on battery as an alternative fuel, but here in the table I included battery cells as well. And manufacturers in other countries, they still think ICEs will be the main or primary power sources for vessels. As I mentioned earlier, in 2019, DNB made this report on alternative fuels. In 2020 and in 2021, many research show that ammonia and other e-fuels will be more available. So ammonia is getting more attention. So by 2030, 2040, and 2050, ammonia will be emerged as one of the most attractive alternative fuels. So we have to remember, we shouldn't forget this graph. As you can see at the bottom left, ship types will change as well. In other words, to transport fossil fuels, tankers were mostly used, but the share of tankers will be reduced and dry bunkers, their share will increase, and they will be fueled by ammonia and other alternative fuels. And cargo tankers, under different scenarios, will not go through significant changes by 2050. So international shipping will continue to play an important role in transport of goods, but it is inevitable that ship constructions should adapt to changes. So in summary, as we heard in the panel discussion of the previous session, all these goals cannot be achieved by one country or one organization. The energy sector and the shipyards and ship owners, all the stakeholders in the industry should work together. Otherwise, we won't be able to achieve IMO's ambitious goals. So we have this common goal. We have to cooperate to achieve the common goal. Regarding policies, carbon ready will be the most important issues we need to discuss now. And each country has their NDC. There is no regulations applicable to domestic vessels, but there will be new regulations introduced that cover domestic vessels. Lastly, life cycle assessment, as I mentioned earlier, is required, and we need to discuss more about alternative fuels, including green ammonia and hydrogen. We have to think hard about their application in the short term. So in summary, again, IMO is discussing global standards for decarbonization. So let's think about how we are going to meet IMO's regulations and what technologies we are going to need to achieve the common goal. On this slide, my point is we have to pay more attention to new alternative fuels, including hydrogen, ammonia, and e-fuels. We need to do more discussion and more research on those fuels, and they require standardization. And that is where we should put our time and effort. With that, I'd like to conclude my presentation. Thank you so much.